What's up, guys? Steven Osentoski here of MGoFish, and welcome to another episode of the Fish Vlog. This is episode 3.5, and today we're going to look at the Big Ten East Conference Outlook Part 2. So I covered the different scenarios for the Big Ten East last week. I'll post a link in the description if you didn't check that out. I figured I'd make a follow-up to that video after this past weekend's game, just to give you guys kind of an update on where the teams stand now. So last weekend, Michigan beat Maryland, Ohio State beat Michigan State, and Penn State beat Rutgers. Two of those three were things we wanted. Obviously, we want Michigan to win. We actually did want Ohio State to beat Michigan State. Unfortunately, Rutgers couldn't pull off the upset against Penn State. So the conference standings after last week, Ohio State is the only one conference loss team remaining in the Big Ten East. Everyone else has two or more losses. There are three teams currently with two conference losses. So let's cover the tiebreakers again really quick. If two teams have the same conference record at the end of the season, you look at the head-to-head matchup between those two teams. If there are three or more teams, there are 8 steps to go through. After each step, if two teams remain, you look at the head-to-head between those two teams. If 3 or more teams remain, you move on to the next step of those 8 steps in the tiebreaker. Okay, scenario 1. Ohio State wins out. Since they are the only one conference loss team in the Big Ten East, Ohio State would be the representative from the Big Ten East. Scenario 2 is where Michigan wins out. I don't really care what happens to Penn State or Michigan State. We want to know what it'll take for Michigan to reach there, right? So, number 2, scenario 2, Michigan wins out. Let's look at scenario 2A, a 4-way tie scenario. So this would mean that Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan State would all have 2 conference losses at the end of the season. This means that Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State all would win out. This would mean that Ohio State would beat Illinois and lose to Michigan to give them their second conference loss. So we go to the first tiebreaker of the 8 steps in a 3+ team tiebreaker. This first step is the record against the other tied teams. Michigan and Penn State are both 1-2. Ohio State and Michigan State are both 2-1. You are left with Ohio State and Michigan State. You look at the head-to-head between those teams. Ohio State beat Michigan State 48-3, I think it was. So Ohio State would be the representative for the Big Ten East. Moving on, scenario 2B, we'll look at the 3-way tie scenarios. There are 3 3-way tie scenarios. So the first one, 2B1. Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. This would mean that both Michigan and Penn State would win out. This would mean that OSU would beat Illinois and lose to Michigan to give them their second conference loss. This would mean that Michigan State would drop a game either to Maryland or Rutgers, one of their final 2 games, to end the season with 3 conference losses. Since the other teams have 2 conference losses, Michigan State would be out of the running. So again, first tiebreaker, record against the other tied teams. All tied teams have 1-1 records against each other. So since we still have 3 teams after the first step, we have to move on to step 2. Step 2 in the 3+ team tiebreaker is the record in your division. So in this case, it would be the 3 tied teams' records in the Big Ten East. In this scenario, Michigan has 2 losses to Big Ten East opponents, being Michigan State and Penn State. Ohio State only has 1 loss in the East, and that would be to Michigan at the end of the season in this scenario. Their other loss to Iowa is in the West Division. Penn State's 2 conference losses are in the East, to Ohio State and Michigan State. Therefore, Ohio State's the only team with 1 conference loss compared to Michigan and Penn State's 2. Therefore, OSU wins after the second 3+ team tiebreaker. Ohio State would be the representative from the Big Ten East. Let's go to 2B2 is Michigan, Ohio State, and Michigan State. This would mean that Michigan and Michigan State would win out to finish the season with 2 conference losses apiece. This would mean that Ohio State again would beat Illinois and lose to Michigan. That loss to Michigan would give them their second conference loss. And finally, that would mean that Penn State would lose either to Nebraska next week or against Maryland at the end of the season to give them their third conference loss. That would eliminate Penn State in this scenario. So again, we go to the first tiebreaker, records against the other tied teams. All teams in this scenario would be 1-1. Step 2 of the tiebreaker is the record within the Big Ten East division. Again, Michigan's 2 losses are to teams in the Big Ten East. We already talked about Ohio State, only have 1 loss in the East. Michigan State only has 1 loss in the East, that's to Ohio State. Their loss to Northwestern is also in the West. Michigan would drop out after this second tiebreaker. You're left with Michigan State and Ohio State. You take the head-to-head between those teams. Ohio State won that matchup. Ohio State would be the Big Ten East representative. And the final 3-team tiebreaker, 2B3, we have Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State. So this one's pretty crazy. Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State all winning out. That's not too crazy. All 3 teams would end up with 2 conference losses. The crazy part is this scenario requires Ohio State to lose to Illinois and lose to Michigan. If Ohio State loses to Illinois, holy shit. So, first tiebreaker, record against the other tied teams. Michigan, unfortunately, is 0-2 since they lost to both Michigan State and Penn State. Michigan State beat the other 2 tied teams, so they would be 2-0, and Penn State would be 1-1. So, MSU is the Big Ten East representative. Okay, finally, so we're past the 4-team scenarios. We're past the 3-team scenarios. Now we're into the head-to-head scenarios. 2C is the head-to-head scenarios here. 2C1, we'll look at Michigan versus Penn State. In this scenario, Michigan and Penn State would both win out to end the season with 2 conference losses. This would mean that Ohio State, again, would lose both of their final games against Illinois and against Michigan. That would give them 3 conference losses, so they would be out. Michigan State currently has 2 conference losses, so this scenario would... Why you do this? Finally, this would mean that Michigan State would lose 1 of their final 2 games, either against Maryland or Rutgers, to end the season also with 3 conference losses. They would be out. So this would leave Penn State and Michigan the only 2 teams in the Big Ten East with 2 conference losses. You take the head-to-head between those teams. Penn State beat Michigan earlier this year. Penn State would be the representative in the Big Ten East. 2C2, Michigan and Michigan State. This would mean that Michigan and Michigan State would both win out to end the season with 2 conference losses. This would mean that Penn State would lose 1 of their final 2, either to Nebraska or Maryland. And this would mean that Ohio State would lose both of their final matchups against Illinois and Michigan. So in that scenario, Michigan and Michigan State are the only remaining 2 conference loss teams in the Big Ten East. You take the head-to-head, Michigan State beat Michigan in a monsoon. Michigan State would be the Big Ten East representative. And finally, here we are. Scenario 2C3. This is Michigan and Ohio State ending up in the head-to-head scenario at the end of the season. This would mean that Michigan would win out. It would beat both Wisconsin and Ohio State. This would mean that Penn State would lose 1 of their final 2, either to Nebraska or Maryland. This would mean that Michigan State would lose at least 1 of their final 2 against Maryland and Rutgers. And finally, this would mean that Ohio State would beat Illinois and lose to Michigan. This scenario isn't that crazy. Penn State is going to be hard to upset, but I could see Rutgers pulling off an upset against Michigan State. So in this scenario, it's Michigan and Ohio State, the only 2 conference loss teams remaining in the Big Ten East. You look at the head-to-head matchup. In this scenario, Michigan beat Ohio State. Therefore, Michigan would be heading to the Big Ten Championship from the East. So, rooting interest for this weekend. Number 1, you obviously need Michigan to beat Wisconsin. Number 2, and probably the least likely, you want Nebraska to beat Penn State. Nebraska is really bad. So, number 3, we want Maryland to beat Michigan State. And finally, as a bonus, it's not needed, but it would be really fun to see Illinois beat Ohio State, just to see the meltdown. Thanks for watching, guys. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, @Steven Toski. Appreciate all the support. As always, guys, go blue.